my name is Stephany, and I am the museum educator at Capital Jewish Museum. Welcome to our Welcoming the Stranger, the Passengers Q&A event. This is the first program in Capital Jewish Museum's latest series, Welcoming the Stranger. And we're pleased to present this in partnership with the Haberman Institute and J by J, a program of the DC JCC. The Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies provides adults with high quality in-depth encounters with Jewish history and thought and culture, as this program will surely do as well. And the Haberman Institute invites you to learn more about their offerings. They always have new classes, lectures, and cultural events happening. Just go ahead and visit their website, habermaninstitute.org, to learn more. Same thing with our other partners, J by J, a program of the DC JCC. They are hosting this film, The Passengers, for us on their Eventive platform. And it's still available until February 28th. So if you haven't had a chance to watch it yet, please do. You can find the link on our website, capitaljewishmuseum.org, under programs, or on their website. And on their website, you'll find some more films, classes, information about their May Film Festival. And so we hope that we'll see you at some of their events. Tonight's program is in webinar form, as you've probably realized, and that means you will not be able to see other attendees. You will only be able to see the presenters and, at this point, my screen that I'm currently sharing with you. So during tonight's Q&A in webinar form, we ask that you use the Q&A box at the bottom. And so you'll see it has two little chat bubbles and says Q&A. You can put all questions for Ryan and David in those boxes. So before we get started, I'm just going to give you a sneak peek at the museum. I know that we have some new names tonight, and so I'm excited to share a little bit about what it is that we are doing and hope to do when we open, and give you a sneak peek of one of the galleries. So this is the Capital Jewish Museum. We have a historic synagogue that will be connected to a new modern building. And this sits on the corner of 3rd and F Streets Northwest, which is near Union Station and just blocks away from the Judiciary Square Metro Station. We had a groundbreaking this past fall, and currently we've started construction with the hopes that we will be open in fall of 2022. The museum will be free and open for special events and rentals, as well as programs like the one we're having tonight. There will be a multi-purpose room and a community lab that hosts both of those, and a permanent and temporary exhibition space that will bring galleries and from around the world into our city. Here's a bird's eye view and a sneak peek at what our permanent exhibition will look like. It will explore Jewish identity in the faces of Jewish Washington, cover issues and how we've talked about them in the past and connect them to how we talk about them in the present. And we'll continue this thread of civic action and civic engagement in our city and with our Jewish identities as we explore democracy and action and all the different ways that we can make change in our communities. We'll be able to learn about the history of Jewish Washington using our interactive digital map table and look at some more stories on almost an interactive game on a tabletop in the corner as well that mimics a Seder table as we explore different stories and themes throughout history. So with that, themes that have emerged from tonight's program and the film, such as Israel, immigration, Jewish identity, will be explored throughout those exhibits and in our future programs and events. We aim to highlight many sides for each story, understanding that all solutions are not black and white, and they're shades of gray, and they're very complex. And earlier this month, in a program that we presented in partnership with Gen Z Jews, we presented one side of a similar issue, and tonight we're going to present another side. I'm looking forward to hearing from Ryan and David about their experiences while filming and after, as well as hearing how we can contribute to help more people from this community. So I'm going to pass it over to Joseph, who is a member of the Capital Jewish Museum Teen Council, who is going to co-moderate with me tonight. My colleague Jacqueline works at Capital Jewish Museum, and she's in the chat to help answer any questions or any tech problems you might be experiencing at the moment. So she's there to help you as well. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Joseph for a little while, and he can introduce and kick us off for the evening.
Ryan Porush is a documentary filmmaker and writer based in Los Angeles. He has produced, filmed, and edited documentaries and short films around the world. He focuses on telling longer, character-driven stories that give voice to communities that are marginalized. The Passengers, Ryan's first feature film, won the Human Rights Jewry Prize at the 2020 Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. David Elcott is the Taub Professor of Practice in Public Service and Leadership at the Wagner School of Public Service at NYU. He is also Faculty Director of the Advocacy and Political Action Specialization at Wagner. He has spent the last 3 decades at the intersection of community building, the search for a theory of cross-boundary engagement, and interfaith and ethnic organizing and activism. Over the past 12 years, Dr. Elcott has worked to build a robust training program of community organizing and advocacy campaigns housed at the Wagner School of Public Service to address important domestic and international issues. With his colleagues, he explores the intersections of social identity, teamwork, marginalization, and grit. We're happy to have both of you here, and we appreciate the opportunity to ask you questions. Our first question, which is directed to both of you, is what has happened with Gezi and Demos since the film was completed?
First of all, thank you for the question, Joseph, and thank you to the Capitol Jewish Museum for having us, for hosting this event, for showcasing the film. This is actually a really exciting thing I get to tell audiences, virtual audiences for now, but since the completion of the film, Gezi, who at the end of the documentary is stuck in Ethiopia, he and his family have since immigrated to Israel, and he is in college, living out his dream in Israel right now, which is beautiful. And that is one of the many things that has happened since the completion of the documentary. As right now and in recent months, there has been movement on this issue. There still remains roughly 6,000 or 7,000 Ethiopian Jews stuck in Ethiopia awaiting Aliyah. But there is an Ethiopian woman who is the Minister of Aliyah and Absorption who has been pushing this issue in Israel. So there is some optimism as of now. Yeah.
And Demos is with his family in Beersheba. They actually own a home now. Demos was working, even though he left college and went to work to support his family. And he's now back. He's studying public policy. And Gezi is studying at the University of Haifa, having done already a year program at Hebrew University. Demos just celebrated his birthday, and the last member of Gezi's family, his brother, who was left in Ethiopia, just arrived in Israel this past week. So the two of them are doing well, which perhaps says something about what happens if you have a very public exposure through a movie that is being shown all over, including in Israel. Not surprisingly, they and their families got on the list to be able to make it on Aliyah. So to some degree, they're becoming known through the movie. Certainly helped them, not obviously the thousands who are still left behind.
Thanks. And how has your experience working with Gezi, Demoz, and others in their community shaped how you're teaching advocacy and approaching advocacy, either as a professor or in your work as a director?
Well, much of my work has been international. I've done work in Indonesia, South Africa, Uganda, South America, and Europe, so in Asia. So, I mean, I've done an enormous amount of work. This is really a different story. In those cases, I was brought in as somebody to help train in civic engagement and organizing. Here, this was different. I went to Ethiopia to witness the last Aliyah of Ethiopian Jews. My wife, Shira, Rabbi Shira Milgram, and I went there. We thought this is it. This is the end. So we wanted to see this community before there would be no Jews left in Ethiopia. The advocacy and the movie, as part of this advocacy effort, was a result of the deep pain and frustration of going to Ethiopia and realizing that the very Jews who were there, who were being celebrated, who were singing to the representatives from Jewish communities all around the world, and were there to commemorate the closing of the Ethiopian community, they weren't going. So, so the very skills that I had acquired in other settings, I was able to apply, and Shira and I were able to apply to this particular very painful circumstance. So whereas the others certainly are an area come from responsibility and training, this really became an action of the heart. And Ryan chose in the movie to focus also on relationships, on falling in love, as we did with Demos and with Gezi. So yeah, we applied. We knew that we had access networks around the country. It's work that I had been doing, that Shira had been doing. The first thing that we had to do, Shira raised the money to keep the compound open. So that was the first act of advocacy. If that compound would have closed, there would have been no place for the Jews in Gondar to gather. And so that became critical. Believe it or not, the Torah, which was the one Torah for the whole community, was going to be shipped back to Israel, leaving them with no Torah. So that too became a battle and a fight. And in that case, NACOJ, the National Association of
North American Jewry.
Yeah. Acted to keep the Torah there. And then the campaign we made the decision to bring Ethiopians so they could speak in their own voice, not simply have us as advocates. And Ryan was brought in. Oh, I get to tell the story first on this side, Ryan, instead of you. Ryan was brought in to do a quick marketing campaign, like a 5-minute, 10-minute campaign, a great short documentary. And I'd worked with him before and I knew he could do that. And then he kept on going, well, I just need to do a little more and a little more. And I'm going, no, I got to get this out. We've got to get this out now. And instead of the 5-minute plan that I had for an advocacy, shoot, we have this very extraordinary full-length film.
This is a question directed to Ryan. Are you planning on creating an additional movie or video that contains an update on the efforts made for Ethiopian Jews to move to Israel?
That's a good question. I'm not planning on making that film as of now. I hope it's not needed. I hope that this issue can be resolved much more quickly than I can get back to Ethiopia and film more. I will say we have footage. There is footage of Gezi arriving in Israel and hugging Demos in the airport in Tel Aviv, which is incredible. And although I don't plan on filming it, we, as David's expressed, were all still in contact and very much, rooting for their lives in Israel, helping them, monitoring them as friends and more, I think.
That's helpful and interesting. A lot of our questions in the chat or in the Q&A are kind of about this, whether or not you're interested in making more films about this or if it's needed. And whether or not in your experience, did you feel that many of the Jewish Ethiopians wanted to immigrate to Israel? Was this something that a large portion of them were trying to do?
The community, in my experience, and the community in Ethiopia, the Jewish community, is the most Zionist community I've ever come across. I've filmed with Hasidics and Hasids in Brooklyn, and I've been in the Old City in Jerusalem before this film, and truly they live and breathe to go to Israel, to go home as they see it, to join their friends and family. And so, and it wasn't about leaving Ethiopia, as David will talk about. Many times there were conversations about maybe allowing Demoz and Gezi to come to the United States or Canada to go to college and have opportunities like that. But they were resolute as when we leave Ethiopia, we're going to Israel. And I think much of the community operates with that faith, I would say.
We can play this straightforward for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Israel brought 1 million Russians to Israel. As a result, Israel is the only country in the Middle East that has shown a significant increase in its Christian population. In other words, our efforts for the Russian Aliyah, the FSU, former Soviet Union Aliyah, actually brought in about a quarter of those brought in are not only not Jewish, they have no interest in being Jewish at all. But we had no doubts about bringing them in spite of the fact that they were many generations, even the ones who were Jews, were many generations removed from being Jewish. I think of greater significance is while we were building this campaign, Ryan and I and Shira and the others and Nakoj, while we were building the campaign, Natan Sharansky, who was then the chair of the Jewish Agency, offered any Spanish or Portuguese Catholic who 500 years ago, their ancestors converted to Christianity, 500 years. They'd been Catholic for 500 years, offered any of them who wanted to come to Israel and Aliyah could do so. Now they would go through conversion, but they were invited back to Israel. Spanish, Portuguese, white European Catholics. In this case, every single person on the list, so just about 12, 15 years ago, the Jewish community shut down in Gondar and Ades. That meant nobody could come in anymore. The only people in the Jewish community were those who had committed themselves to go to Israel, learned Hebrew, participated in service, lived a Jewish life. So every single one of those who want to come have three features in their favor. One, they have family in Israel. Two, they have committed themselves to living as Jews, particularly the younger ones. It's the only thing they've known their own life. Three, they descend from Jews, not 500 years ago, not 200 years ago, but maximum 100 years ago. So it's really important, let me say it actually differently. To pose the question, who are they? Are they Jews? Should they be allowed to come to Israel? You have to ask yourself why you're asking that question. Because we didn't ask that question about Russian Christians coming. We didn't ask that question. We actually were very thrilled to hear that there were actually Spanish and Portuguese Catholics from 500 years ago who would be interested in coming to Israel. So you have to ask the question, why would you question Black Africans who can trace themselves back thousands of years to the Jewish people and the Jewish community? So we feel, very strongly, these are not questions that are fair to ask anymore. The Ethiopian government accepts that they will go on Aliyah. The Israeli government has committed itself to bring them on Aliyah. like all the Ethiopians, they would go through formal conversion, although you should know that every boy in that community was circumcised on the 8th day, that they have kept kosher, kept Shabbat, right? It's a very traditional community. So from our perspective, this movie is not about asking for something new. It's simply asking Israel to do exactly what I would think every one of you on this webinar would say is the message of Israel, kibbutz galuyot. Israel was created as the ingathering of exiles from all over the world, those who had been oppressed, those who were free, that is the raison d'etre for Israel. And all this movie was about was to fulfill that promise.
One question we received from a viewer is, how have Israelis reacted to the film, and depending on their community?
I did a showing of the movie. It was actually incredibly moving. Demos was there because he had come already on Aliyah. And the members of the press, members of government, representatives from the offices of government were there. And it was really incredibly positive. It was distressing to me that the Jewish agency leadership wasn't there, that our own JFNA, the organized Jewish community here, also now they've taken it up, but at the time where everyone said, oh, this is very important, but we're not going to do anything about it. So, that's why we continue to show the movie. That's why we're showing it to you. We're not showing it to you just to give you entertainment. I know it's COVID and everybody's desperately looking for something to watch when we're sitting in our homes, but that's not why we're doing this. We're doing this to hope that you will also engage, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that. I do want to say that the last Aliyah that came in from Ethiopia was funded by the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem. That is an evangelical right-wing Christian group whose policies and other issues probably most of us would find abhorrent, but they actually paid for this, not the Jewish community, not your federation, not JDC, not the Israeli government. It was coming from a Christian evangelical group that believes that we want to bring all the Jews you can so that when Armageddon occurs, we can have the second coming for Christians. So the reason for this movie is very direct. We need to continue putting pressure on until what we will have in Ethiopia will be museums of a once vibrant community.
You mentioned that that was really moving when you showed the film, and would you say that is the experience by and large for many like Demoz and Gezi, or what kind of support in general do they get from the Israeli community?
I mean, Israel has done great stuff. It's very important that we make that clear. There are probably now close to 150,000 Ethiopians in Israel, all of whom, by the way, had to go through conversion when they came. Israel provides educational programs. Israel underwrites the tuition for their school. We created a fund called Aliyah to College that actually generously a number of funders and foundations in Washington, D.C. actually support. Gezi would not be in college were it not for the fact that we underwrote his being able to go to pay for his room and board, that he has food to eat and a bed to sleep on. But Israel has Israel has problems with race, as we do in the United States. But Israel is the only country in the world that voluntarily brought in Black Africans, voluntarily brought them in and made them full citizens. Gezi and Demos are full citizens of the state of Israel. They vote in elections, they participate fully. It's very important to say this over and over again. Nobody is asking Israel to take some type of humanitarian effort. This is about Israel fulfilling its own promise of what it is, and it's about the Jewish community that we're speaking to take that responsibility, that relationship seriously with Israel as well.
Another question we have is, what is your impression of how Gezi and Demos have been absorbed into Israeli society? Has it lived up to their dreams and expectations?
I'll answer the first part of this, I guess. I think they're doing great. They also had no unrealistic expectations about what Israel would be. They've been on Facebook and WhatsApp with friends and family that have lived in Israel for several years now. So on a fundamental level, they knew what to expect, but they also really did view it as going home, and not just to again get out of Ethiopia. So I think they're thriving and will continue to become even greater contributing members to Israel.
One of the funny lines came from Washington. You may have seen this scene in Washington. It was at the law firm right across from the White House office, the office building on the West Wing, and one of the people turns to Gezi and Demos and say, "Where do you live in Israel?" Because they were speaking in Hebrew, right? They were like, and they go, "No, you don't understand. We don't live in Israel. We can't go to Israel." But that gives you kind of an idea. They were very aware of the conditions. They were on with their friends who had made Aliyah, many of them in the military, in the army. They were on with them every single day, talking with their family members that they hadn't seen for over a decade on a regular basis. Thank God for WhatsApp and the ability to be able to do exactly what we're doing, to communicate virtually. And I think Ryan's point is another point for us to recognize. These guys were literate in 3 languages, computer literate. Gezi has taken his courses in advanced math and molecular biology and chemistry. We're not talking about some poor, illiterate African community that we have in our mind, these poor people. It's true that some of the older people coming, like immigrants in the United States, like many of your grandparents or great-grandparents who came here, never really learned English. They worked as tailors. They worked in, the Lower East Side or in Southeast Washington. But their children and grandchildren have done just fine. And that is what we're seeing with so many of the Ethiopians as well. All the more reason, to continue to give them this support.
In our Q&A, we're getting a lot of questions about advocacy and what we can do. So something that someone was asking was, I've lost my question, is what can we do to influence the government to fulfill their promise? So what roles can we play as advocates to get our leaders to make change for us?
Well, feel free when this is over to email or write a note to my very dear, cherished, close friend, Mark Levitt, who is the president of the Federation. And remind him, he by the way, it's his son was the film editor for this movie, and Mark has been very supportive, but you're more than welcome to write him and say Washington should continue its advocacy to make sure that the Jews who are left in Ethiopia are protected, and I know that they are doing that, and to continue the advocacy to bring the last remnant into Israel. You can sign the petition if you go on to, Ryan, I think, has that info if you go onto the movie site to do that.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat too. And there's also information about the Aliyah to College Fund that David mentioned as a way to help the Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel, young men and women like Gezi who need funding. Israel will pay for his tuition, but not much more. And so we're raising money to help young Ethiopian immigrants in Israel with the cost of attending college. And so that is where we are accepting donations. Beyond that, just as many screenings like this within the Jewish community and outside. But I mean, as David mentioned, beyond hopefully learning about this issue and that it is still with us, that the diaspora does have a role to play. And in asking your local synagogue or JCC or nonprofit to potentially host a screening or to exert some influence over the Jewish activist community, over Israel, whatever it may be, is important and has caused some of this recent movement that I mentioned earlier, where about 2,000 Ethiopian Jews have come to Israel. David might have the specifics, but many North American organizations have shifted their stance or stepped up and contributed on this issue in the past year.
One of our audience members is wondering if the Ethiopian government is supportive of these efforts for Ethiopian Jews to make Aliyah.
Yes. Straightforward, it's yes. There's been no problem. Earlier, the first Aliyah, the Jewish community paid for them to come, gave money to what was then the Marxist government in Ethiopia. But since then, the government's fine. I mean, everyone has the right to emigrate from Ethiopia. I just want to again make really clear. There has been no additions other than demographically through birth and death to the Jewish community left in Ethiopia, because you can't go into the compound unless you have been part of that community now, which is well over 10 years. So children who are born can will obviously be added. But for example, in the weeks, Gezi's grandmother and her brother and sister, Gezi's great aunt and uncle, his grandmother's brother and sister, went on Aliyah as Jews. His grandmother, for complicated reasons, didn't. So that's a great example of the confusion of this. And unfortunately, she died just weeks before the family would have gone on Aliyah. So she had spent decades fighting to go and died shortly before.
I'm seeing sorry, Joseph, if I'm stepping on your toes here. I think the IDF question, there was a question, will they be able to serve in the IDF? It's heartbreaking that they didn't. Demoz and Gezi, that was one of their dreams, is to go to Israel and to serve in the IDF, and they won't get to live out that part of their dream. They essentially aged out of the army, and hopefully their younger peers and children will get that opportunity.
Sorry. We're seeing the questions as you are as well. I just want to tell you something. This is for me, it's one of the strangest things of all. Thinking about Black Lives Matter in the United States, thinking about BDS, the attacks on Israel, uniquely on Israel, that somehow Israel is doing terrible things, so much more terrible than any other country in the world, that there should be boycotts from Israel, right? You would think that the Israeli government would use bringing in Black Africans in as citizens as the greatest marketing tool that any country has ever had available to them. Certainly, if you wanted to mobilize across the United States support for Israel and undermine the BDS movement, you would show Black Africans coming. That scene that you saw with Demos when he arrives, the dancing and the singing and the celebration. And Ryan has, you're not showing it, Ryan, it's a shame. He has a video of Gezi and the same thing. Could you imagine if that was used by the Israeli government, the foreign ministry, to publicize around the world, the only country in the world, while other countries are closing their borders and people are drowning in the Mediterranean, and their families are being torn apart and put in cages on the border of the United States. Could you imagine what this would be? I don't know.
We're talking, 7,000 maybe at this point into a country of how many million, whereas in the past, leaders from 3 countries and 3 continents came together for a covert military operation that brought thousands who walked through Sudan. Now it's not even on the radar, and the government, it's like they can't be bothered. And I think David returns to the idea that it is an agenda setting issue, but that as complex as it was in the past and as easy as it is now to finish the job, I think it's indicative of a changing Israel, of a changing relationship, of a progressive North American Jewish community with Israel, that so much has changed that the job can't be finished when it's just right there. And seemingly we all agree that they should be in Israel, or the majority, I would say. And in this film, and even in the film, you see it when David and Demoz and Gezi talk to people, even if they are hesitant on helping, everyone says you should be in Israel. When they hear them speak Hebrew to their face, like, nobody can say you should not be in Israel. And so there's a disconnect with how to get it done, clearly.
I didn't want to jump in case someone was speaking again. I think I saw a lot of what we've been talking about has definitely been related to looking at Demoz and Gezi's specific journey and trying to find comparisons to them and kind of the larger community at whole. But I also think what's really interesting is that relationship between the 2 men in the film themselves. And especially given now that they are in 2 different places, how did you kind of see that evolve, and what is their relationship like now at all? Is there any way that you can touch on that?
I don't know.
Yeah, so I'll back into it. They are in different places, but in the same country. I approached the film most interested in these 2 individuals who were thrust into this moment in history for their community, where they are leaders and representatives of this community, and their friendship and that pressure and their journey and their identity crisis, their in terms of David says it in the film, being, and the title of the film refers to this, being passengers, being too Jewish for Ethiopia, but too Black for Israel, or not Jewish enough for Israel. And so I always wanted the viewer to care about Demoz and Gezi, and through them care about this issue of Ethiopian Jewry, and how are we gonna, as the, in this case, as the diaspora, help them, right? Help them finish the job, help them get to Israel. And so, yeah, I mean, I could have never predicted, obviously, what would happen in terms of not just what happens in the movie, but in terms of my relationship with David and with Demoz and Gezi, and how that grew and changed, and what I witnessed between them as well. And so I am, that's one of the things I'm most proud of, is that at its core, I think it's an issue, it's a movie not about an issue, but about people.
For a final wrap-up question, we have a question directed to Ryan. Are you satisfied with your movie? Does it meet your expectations? Is there anything you wish you had done differently?
Oh, I think I feel like I almost just provided my answer for that, actually. I am happy with it, because I'm happy that I think it has a humanity to it, and that comes from just these two young men and their story, and their finding a father figure and growing as Jews and as humans. And I did get a lot of, even from myself, I would say, a lot of feedback that I need to go interview. I need Netanyahu on camera. I need these politicians and academics and decision authors, like, let's get them on interview and try to dissect this issue that, to me, not only is it, I would say, endlessly complicated, like so much involving Israel is, but it's also just not as interesting to me as the human story I was talking about. So that's why one of the reasons why I didn't want to make that sort of movie. But I partly because I think it would not have been as effective.
Thanks. And I guess I'm wondering the same thing for David, in a way, of whether or not you felt that, because I know you two kind of worked together along it in the making of this a little bit. So did you feel that there was anything that you were really hoping would come from the film theme-wise that you wish you could have added more into, or something would have gone a little bit differently?
As you saw, that brief moment in the movie, my mother was a refugee from Germany, fled the country at 17. Most of her family was wiped out. I was brought, and you saw that. My mother died shortly after Ryan filmed her, so it was probably the last filming of her alive. And so I was brought up as the child of refugees, and that affected me both in terms of what I've done since, in terms of fighting for immigrant rights around the world, and for protecting asylum seekers and refugees and those most vulnerable, and in my own community to fight for that which is just and right in the community. As an early teen, I went to live in Israel in a youth Aliyah village with refugees. The older kids, I was younger, but the older ones were refugees who came from the camps in Europe, from the displaced person camps after World War II. And the ones who were my age were ones who came from Iraq and Yemen and Morocco. So I was deeply immersed in the Israel that was Liot Am Chofshi Ba'arzenu, to be a free people in our own land. And the prayer which we pray before saying the Shema, at night or in the morning about the returning, our people returning, this kibbutz galuyot, the returning of of those who were scattered around the world. Brought up with that, and with the Jewish community that has at its core the principle of never again, it was painful for me as somebody who has spent much of my life with the leadership of the organized Jewish community across the continent, in Canada as well. It was painful for me to go from community to community where people said, yes, this is very important, this is so moving. Unfortunately, there's nothing we could do. When I went to the head of the JDC who says, we're going to shut down the infirmary, we're going to shut down the food kitchen, we're going to close it. I'm sorry, and as I'm leaving the room, he says, but if I were you, I would do exactly what you're doing. So I had to get over the sense of not understanding my community in this. As I said, for American Jews in particular, we who fought incredibly hard in the 1950s and 60s for civil rights, the Brown versus Board of Education, the meetings on that took place in the Religious Action Center in Washington, DC, in your community, to fight for the rights of those most marginalized and oppressed. The idea that my community, the community that I love and which I have dedicated my life, did not stand and say, this is unacceptable, these are marginalized, these are oppressed, these are passengers who are not Ethiopian enough to be in Ethiopia. I think that was really hard for me. I think it's hard for Ryan. I think it was hard for Demoz and Gezi to understand when they got these responses of, yes, you're beautiful. People stood up and applauded and then said, but there's nothing we can do. So, I'm looking, to your credit, I really want to thank you. There are well over 100 screens and many of them are couples. So these are a lot of people. And I would hope that one of the ways to allay our disappointment is that as a result of this, you will go to the site that Ryan gave you, that you'll sign the petition, that you'll speak to your federation and to the Jewish organizations, in your community, and if you can, to send a contribution through NACOJ for Aliyah to college to make sure that this last incredible, beautiful remnant of the Jewish people that has kept the faith for thousands of years of isolation from the rest of the Jewish community. The idea of bringing them home, I think, will be remembered as one of the most remarkable actions of the Jewish people, of Jewish fidelity, and of the state of Israel in its history.
Thank you, David and Ryan. I think that those are, what a strong note to go out on as we wrap up our program. Thank you so much for your time and for the film and for your advocacy around this issue and this topic, and for helping us raise awareness tonight and giving some people some tools and ways that they can actively become involved and make a difference in their community. So this has been recorded and will be available within 48 hours on our YouTube and webpage, so that anyone who wasn't able to join tonight can also watch later, and that those who joined tonight can share this with family and friends as we continue to spread awareness and support the film. And so Jacqueline is putting that information in the chat of where you can find it. I also just want to thank again the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies and for Jewish Learning, and for J by J, both of our partners who made this program possible and gave us a lot of support around it when J by J brought it to us, and we also brought it to the Haberman Institute. We have tons more programs coming up. March kicks off Women's History Month, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one more time before we end the evening to show everyone some of our upcoming programs. And so you'll see that we have several programs for Women's History Month. And don't forget that you can still view the film through February 28th. So if you didn't have a chance to watch it, please make sure you do. And if we can be of any help for you, you can always email us at info@capitaljewishmuseum.org. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to Joseph for stepping up to the plate as a member of our teen council and moderating a discussion and being part of the planning process, and to Ryan and David for providing some insight on the film and this issue.
Thank you for having us. Can't wait to visit the museum someday.